Visit to CENTCOM on Saturday. He says he saw firsthand how missile intercepts are taking place and praised troops as the best of America. General Dan Kaine says the military has started conducting the first overland B-52 missions and taking on more dynamic targets. He's also praising those working on our national assembly lines, calling them a different front line, just as critical to our nation's security. Let's bring in ABC News contributor, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Mick Mulroy, for more. Mick, what sticks out to you most from the announcements they just made in this presser?
So, Diane, it's clear that we're becoming closer and closer to our military objectives. He talked about the strikes that happened on Isfahan. There was a lot of concern that they had a lot of their missiles and drones in these very difficult to reach mountainsides. Essentially, the granite there is so impenetrable that even our mops have a difficult time getting to it. But it does appear, obviously, from the secretary's statements and the chairman's, but also from social media posts, that we did strike something significant. We saw several secondary explosions. So it looks like we got to that. The question now is going to be, once the United States has met their military objectives, is there an off-ramp? Is the United States going to have a strategic pause? Are we going to see if the Iranians will be willing? Well, I think the best way to put it, there's a new version of the old regime. Most of the people that we're talking to, for example, the foreign minister, Arakci, the speaker of the parliament, who is a former IRGC commander, Galibaf, they were there and they've been there for decades. So this is still the same regime. They, of course, saw significant losses from the former Supreme Leader on down, which has caused, I think, to go with it and potentially open the strait. Or will they continue to keep the strait closed, which would probably necessitate an escalation or at least a new phase of this, which would likely be, to open the strait by force.
Mick, there's been a lot of contrast between what the president and the administration in general are saying as far as talks and negotiations with Iran go and what's coming out of Iran. Now we just heard Hegseth saying that regime change has occurred, that there is a new regime in Iran. What do you make of that?
A lot of disruption operationally, for sure, and certainly sent a message, but it is the same regime. And a lot of the people that are left are just as hardline or potentially even more hardline than the ones that they are replacing. So negotiations aren't going to be easy, but certainly worth the effort, as escalation would likely increase the consequences of this substantially. All of the impacts to the global energy market and obviously the global economy.
Hey everyone, this briefing did not sound like a routine battlefield update. It sounded like officials trying to tell the public that the military phase is moving in America's favor, while the political phase may be getting more dangerous. The biggest line was not about bombs, missiles, or even the new B-52 missions. It was the claim that regime change has already occurred in Iran, followed immediately by a warning that the new leadership should cut a deal. That matters right now because if that claim is solid, Washington is signaling leverage. If it is overstated, Washington may be talking as if the war is closer to resolution than it really is. And that is where miscalculation begins. What we are seeing on the surface is a military update. Underneath it is a test of whether tactical success is creating strategic control or just creating a more chaotic version of the same problem. There were some concrete signs of momentum in the briefing. The Defense Secretary described an unannounced trip to Central Command and said he watched missile intercepts firsthand. The chairman said the military has begun the first overland B-52 missions and is now striking more dynamic targets. That is not a small detail. Moving from fixed sites to dynamic targets suggests the campaign is no longer just about punishing infrastructure. It is about chasing movement, adaptation, and survival inside the enemy system. In plain English, this means the war is entering a more fluid and potentially more unstable phase. Because once you start hunting mobile assets, command nodes, and time-sensitive targets, the margin for error narrows and the pressure to keep escalating grows. The most significant operational claim may be the one about those hardened missile and drone sites in the mountains. There was concern that some of these locations were buried behind rocks so dense that even powerful bunker-busting weapons would struggle to penetrate. Now officials are pointing to what appear to be major, secondary explosions after the latest strikes. If that assessment holds, it would mean one of Iran's toughest protected stockpiles has been hit in a meaningful way. That is a real military gain. It could reduce launch capacity, shrink Iran's room to threaten shipping, and weaken its ability to sustain retaliation. But here is where the story gets harder. Destroying storage is not the same as destroying intent, and it is definitely not the same as creating a stable end state. That is where the public version starts to tend. The sharpest contradiction in this briefing is simple. Officials are projecting confidence, but the political picture they are describing is far less settled than the military language suggests. The claim that there is now a new regime in Iran is the most dramatic example. Based on the public record described here, what seems more plausible is not a clean break with the old order, but a damaged leadership structure with familiar hardliners still in place. That distinction matters enormously. A genuinely new regime might be more willing to negotiate, open the strait, and take an off-ramp. A reshuffled version of the same power system may do the opposite. It may feel cornered, humiliated, and more determined to prove it can still inflict pain. So the strongest argument for the administration's position is clear. The pressure may be working. Missile fire and drone attacks appear to be falling. Key storage and launch sites may have been hit. Senior figures may be disrupted. The military is gangplank its doted, forcing the other side toward a deal by steadily reducing its options. The Rimensai where it is supposed to do, forcing the other side right at it. That is the advantage. Pressure can create leverage. It can also shorten a war if the other side concludes that continued resistance is hopeless. But the strongest criticism is just as strong. If Washington starts talking as though political collapse has already happened, while the surviving leadership in Tehran still sees itself as intact, then both sides may be reading the same battlefield in dangerously different ways. That is the weakness. Tactical gains can produce strategic overconfidence, and overconfidence in a crisis zone is not strength. It is exposure. The briefing also hinted at the next pressure point without fully resolving it, the strait. That may be the real hinge of this entire story. If Iran chooses to keep that waterway disrupted or closed, then the conflict stops being mainly about missile sites and leadership claims. It becomes about global energy flows, shipping risk, insurance costs, and whether the United States is prepared to force the waterway open. That is a much bigger question. One path leads to a pause and possible negotiation. The other leads to a new phase, with wider economic shock and a higher chance of regional spillover. So widen the lens here. From a military perspective, fewer incoming missiles in the last 24 hours could mean the campaign is working and Iran is running short. From an intelligence perspective, it could also mean Iran is holding back for a more consequential strike later, perhaps tied to islands near the strait or to neighboring states. From a market perspective, even the possibility of that second scenario is enough to keep traders, insurers, and governments on edge. This is why raw launch numbers do not tell the whole story. Sometimes less fire means less capacity. Sometimes it means more patience. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes this moment so dangerous. There was another revealing line in the briefing when the chairman praised workers on the National Assembly lines as a different front line. That may sound rhetorical, but it points to the deeper layer here. This is not just a clash of missiles and air power. It is also a test of industrial endurance, supply chains, intercept rates, munitions production, and how long a modern state can sustain high-tempo operations without political fatigue setting in at home. That is where the story gets bigger. Once wars start reaching back into factories, inventories, and production schedules, the battlefield is no longer just overseas. It is inside the system. And that means the visible strikes are only one part of a broader contest over stamina. Reddened with could spat. It leaves us with a real possibility that the United States is achieving meaningful military objectives, while still facing a far messier political and strategic problem than the briefing language implies. It leaves us with evidence of damage, disruption, and reduced fire from Iran, but not yet clear proof of durable control over what comes next. It leaves us with one apparent success and one unresolved threat sitting side by side. battlefield momentum on one hand, and a still dangerous straight crisis on the biggest odd, and the biggest quest, and that will need that when. Has this campaign pushed Iran toward a deal, or merely pushed the surviving leadership toward a different and potentially more reckless phase? Let me know where you come down on that, because this is exactly the kind of moment where grounded debate matters more than slogans. Watch the next move closely. That is where the real meaning of this briefing will be decided. And subscribe, because this story is not slowing down. The next shift could change everything.